the everlasting hunger. The northern woods of Blackwater Creek were dark and dense, almost untouched by humans for generations. Locals spoke of the eerie silence that blanketed the forest, as if even the birds and insects dared not make a sound. It was said that the deeper you went, the more you'd feel an unsettling presence, like a set of watchful eyes peering from the shadows. Riley, a rugged outdoorsman with an adventurous spirit, had heard the rumors for years. Tales of hunters who ventured too far into the Blackwater woods and never returned, or the ones who did return with haunted eyes and stories of strange, starving creatures. Most blamed the biting cold and hunger-induced hallucinations, yet some whispered of an ancient beast that lurked in the heart of those woods, the Wendigo. Ignoring his friend's warnings, Riley decided to test his courage against the wilderness. Armed with a sturdy rifle, supplies, and a sturdy flashlight, he set out under the overcast sky on the first day of winter. Snow began falling softly as he hiked deeper, the forest seeming to close in tighter around him. Hours passed, and as the shadows grew long, he came across an old crumbling cabin half buried in snow. The door hung open, creaking faintly with the wind. Driven by curiosity, Riley pushed the door wider, revealing a dimly lit interior with walls scratched and marked as if someone, or something, had clawed to escape. The air was thick with an odor of rot and decay, making his stomach churn. Then he noticed it, a bony handprint on the window, too large to be human. The handprint was jagged and skeletal, stretching long and thin across the frost-laced window pane. Riley's pulse quickened. He glanced around the cabin, half expecting to see some shadowy figure lurking in the corners, but only silence greeted him. As Riley took a step back, his boot crunched against something brittle. Looking down, he saw bones, small, gnawed clean, and scattered across the floor. Panic crept in, icy and sharp. These weren't animal bones, and something had feasted here recently. Ignoring the growing unease, he turned to leave, but his eyes caught movement outside the window. A figure in the distance, obscured by thick snowfall, stood motionless at the tree line. It was gaunt, with limbs stretched impossibly long, draped in a thin layer of skin that clung to its skeletal frame. The creature's head turned slightly, and even from this distance, Riley felt its gaze pierce through him. A hollow ache spread through his chest, like something ancient and primal was awakening deep within him. Riley stumbled back, gripping his rifle tighter. The stories he'd dismissed as myths crashed into his mind. A Wendigo, a creature of insatiable hunger and despair, was watching him. The figure vanished into the snow as suddenly as it had appeared, but Riley could still sense its presence. Worse, he realized he could smell it now, the sharp, putrid scent of decay lingering in the air. And it was getting closer. Riley's heart hammered as he stepped out of the cabin, rifle clutched tightly in his gloved hands. The faint smell of decay still lingered, carried by the biting wind. He scanned the tree line, every nerve on edge, half expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows. But the woods were still, shrouded in a deathly quiet. As he moved away from the cabin, he noticed deep, irregular footprints trailing off into the forest. Each print was unnaturally long and narrow, pressed deep into the fresh snow. They led in the same direction he had come from, weaving back toward Blackwater Creek and leaving a winding path through the trees. Part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the cursed woods and forget what he had seen, but something deeper, more primal, urged him forward. His curiosity mixed with a terrible dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow meant to follow those tracks, as if had already set something in motion that could not be undone. He followed the tracks cautiously, moving as quietly as he could, senses straining for any sound or movement. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the forest became. Shadows seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally, and faint whispers began to drift on the wind, just on the edge of hearing. It sounded like his name, drawn out in ragged breaths. Then the tracks stopped abruptly. Riley froze, realizing he was now in the heart of the forest, surrounded by towering trees that blotted out the weak winter sun. The snow around him was undisturbed, and the tracks simply vanished. But as he looked down, he noticed the faintest traces of blood marking the snow, leading off into the darkness between the trees. A chill ran through him, and he fought back the urge to turn and run. He took a shaky breath, his fingers tightening around the rifle. He would keep going. Whatever this creature was, whatever ancient evil lurked in these woods, Riley knew he was no longer just an intruder. He was prey. Riley pressed forward, following the faint blood trail deeper into the woods. The air was colder here, as though something ancient and hollow had sucked the life out of the place. The trees loomed tall and silent around him, their bare branches twisted and clawing against the dim gray sky. Every few steps he glanced over his shoulder, convinced he would see the creature stalking him from the shadows. But the forest remained quiet, too quiet. Not a single bird nor sound of animals flittering through the underbrush. It was just the soft sound of his own breathing and the crunch of snow beneath his boots. The blood trail led him to a small clearing, where the ground was covered in fresh, powdery snow. In the center of the clearing lay an old, crumpled tent, half buried and torn, as if it had been ravaged by something violent. The fabric was shredded, with pieces strewn across the ground, and scattered around it were belongings: a flashlight, a tattered journal, and what looked like pieces of torn clothing. The items were worn, almost frozen in place by time, but the blood marking the snow was fresh. Riley approached the tent cautiously, his rifle raised. He nudged the flap open with the barrel, revealing the dark, hollow space inside. It was empty, just an abandoned campsite left to rot in the heart of the woods. But something about it felt wrong, as though the tent itself were somehow tainted by the presence of something unholy. He crouched down, reaching for the journal. Its cover was faded and torn, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. The entries were short, scribbled in hurried handwriting, as if written by someone who didn't have much time. He flipped through, reading fragments. "Something's out here. I can feel it watching me. I haven't seen another soul in days. I keep hearing whispers. Can't tell if they're real or just the wind. Saw it tonight. It's not human. God, what is that thing?" The last entry was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's hungry. It's always hungry. I don't think I'm going to make it." Riley felt a chill run down his spine, realizing that this person had likely never left the forest. The whispers on the wind felt louder now, pressing in from every side, wrapping around him like tendrils of shadow. He stuffed the journal into his pack, feeling as if he were carrying a piece of someone's terror with him. Then he heard it. A soft, dragging sound from just beyond the clearing. He whipped around, his pulse racing, eyes straining to see through the shadows. At first there was nothing, only the trees, stretching up and out, and the thick, suffocating silence. But then he saw it. A figure moved slowly between the trees, its gaunt, skeletal form almost blending into the shadows. It towered over the ground, its limbs impossibly long, and its hollow, sunken eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It sniffed the air, its head tilting as it caught Riley's scent, and then its lips pulled back to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. Riley stumbled back, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs. He lifted his rifle, his fingers trembling as he took aim. But before he could fire, the creature tilted its head back and let out a shrill, blood-curdling wail that echoed through the forest, rattling the very trees. The Wendigo had found him, and it was hungry. The Wendigo's wail sliced through the forest like a blade, echoing off the trees and filling Riley's ears with a shrill, inhuman hunger. He stumbled back, barely able to keep his grip on the rifle as his body was seized by a primal, overpowering fear. Riley didn't wait. He turned and bolted into the trees, each step breaking through the snow with heavy, desperate crunches. Branches scratched his face and arms as he tore through the underbrush, heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, he heard the creature's footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and far too close. Every instinct screamed at him to run faster, but his body was already nearing its limits. The cold air burned his lungs, and his legs felt leaden as he pushed forward, dodging between the trees, barely staying ahead of the Wendigo's relentless pursuit. He could feel its presence at his back, the foul stench of decay growing stronger with each passing second. A quick glance over his shoulder revealed the creature's dark silhouette gliding between the trees, its limbs moving unnaturally fast, its hollow eyes locked onto him with a terrifying hunger. There was no way he could outrun it forever. Desperately, he searched the forest for any sign of escape. Then, up ahead, he spotted a fallen tree, a massive trunk half buried in snow. In a flash of instinct, he threw himself over it, dropping to the ground and pressing his body against the trunk, hoping the thick wood would shield him from view. He lay there, barely breathing, his pulse hammering in his ears as he listened to the creature's footsteps slow. It was close now, almost on top of him, and he could hear its heavy, ragged breathing as it searched the area, its hunger palpable. The Wendigo sniffed the air, its guttural growl resonating through the silence. Riley clutched his rifle, his fingers trembling. His mind raced, trying to decide whether he should fire or stay hidden. Every fiber of his being wanted to run, to get as far away from the creature as possible, but he knew any sudden movement would reveal him. Then he heard the creature's voice, a low, mocking whisper that sounded like the forest itself was speaking. Riley, his blood ran cold. How did it know his name? Riley, the voice repeated, drawn out and distorted, echoing off the trees. It sounded almost human, yet twisted, corrupted, as though it were imitating a voice it didn't truly understand. A paralyzing dread gripped him. He forced himself to lie still, hoping the creature would move on. But the Wendigo didn't leave. Instead, it circled the fallen tree, sniffing the air, edging closer with each step. Riley's mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but he couldn't bring himself to move, trapped by the creature's hollow, insidious voice. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The footsteps faded into the distance, swallowed by the silence of the woods. Riley held his breath, hardly daring to believe his luck. But as he shifted slightly to get a better look, his boots scuffed the snow. The creature's head whipped back in his direction, and its eyes met his through the gap in the tree. With a sickening screech, it lunged. Riley barely managed to scramble to his feet as the Wendigo lunged, its gnarled, bony fingers clawing through the snow where he'd been crouching. His instincts kicked in, and he bolted deeper into the forest, zigzagging through the trees in a desperate attempt to lose it. He could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind him, moving far too fast, its unnatural wails filling the cold night air. The rifle was still in his hands, but firing in the dark, on the run, was almost impossible. Every ounce of his energy went into survival as he darted through the shadows, the forest seeming to close in around him as he ran. Just when he thought he'd exhausted every last bit of his strength, he spotted a rocky outcrop ahead, a small cave, barely visible beneath the thick layer of snow and ivy. Without a second thought, he threw himself toward it, sliding through the narrow entrance and pressing himself back against the cold stone. Breathing heavily, he stared out into the night, hoping he'd finally found a moment of safety. The Wendigo stopped just outside the cave, tilting its head as it scanned the darkness. Its skeletal frame stretched in the moonlight, every bone and joint visible beneath the pale, sickly skin. Riley clamped a hand over his mouth, trying to quiet his ragged breathing as the creature sniffed the air, moving closer to the entrance. Its empty, hollow eyes seemed to peer into the cave, searching for him, and for a horrible moment, Riley was certain it could see straight through the shadows. He could feel its hunger, its insatiable need to devour, like a tangible weight pressing down on him. The Wendigo's voice drifted into the cave, that same haunting whisper, dragging out his name. Riley. His heart nearly stopped. It sounded almost like his father's voice, a memory twisted and distorted. The familiarity made his stomach churn, a mixture of fear and nausea, and he pressed himself harder against the wall, fighting the primal urge to run. Then, slowly, the creature backed away from the cave entrance. It moved with an unsettling grace, vanishing into the shadows as quietly as it had appeared. Riley kept his eyes fixed on the entrance, his body tense, waiting for any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, until he could no longer hear the creature's footsteps. Finally, he allowed himself to exhale, his muscles shaking with exhaustion and fear. But he knew better than to believe he was safe. He had seen the intelligence in the Wendigo's gaze, the way it seemed to understand exactly how to provoke his fear. Riley pulled out the journal he'd found at the campsite, flipping through its pages with shaky hands. The last few entries spoke of the Wendigo's tactics, of how it would stalk its prey for days, tormenting them, breaking them down until they were weak and desperate. The final entry was smeared, barely readable. It knows my thoughts. It uses them. It becomes them. His mind spun with terror. He realized the creature was playing a game, a sick, twisted hunt that went beyond simple hunger. It wanted him afraid, vulnerable, broken. From somewhere deep within the forest, another wail pierced the silence, echoing through the trees. It was louder this time, and closer. The hunt was far from over. Riley stayed pressed against the cold stone of the cave, his mind racing as he tried to figure out a way to escape. He could hear the Wendigo's haunting wail growing fainter, but he knew it was only giving him a small reprieve. The journal's final warning repeated in his mind, "It knows my thoughts. It uses them. It becomes them." He swallowed hard, fighting back the sickening fear that twisted in his stomach. If he was going to survive, he needed to stay calm, to outsmart the creature that had made these woods its hunting ground. Every instinct told him to run, to get as far from the forest as possible, but he knew that would only lead him deeper into the Wendigo's game. Slowly he crawled to the mouth of the cave, peering out into the snow-covered forest. The shadows seemed darker now, as though the creature's very presence had tainted the world around it. The trees twisted in the dim light, taking on grotesque shapes that played tricks on his mind. Steeling himself, Riley pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on, and held it out into the darkness. Scanning the area around the cave, snowflakes drifted lazily through the beam of light, glistening like tiny ghosts in the air. The forest was silent, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting. Then, just at the edge of the light, he saw something strange. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, swaying gently in the breeze. It was stained dark, frozen to a stiffened texture, and looked eerily familiar. Squinting, Riley realized it matched the clothes he had seen scattered around the campsite earlier. As he stepped out of the cave to investigate, a voice echoed through the trees, his own voice. "Riley." The whisper was soft, barely more than a breath, but he recognized it instantly. It was as if the creature was mimicking him, turning his own fear back on him. He shined the flashlight toward the sound, his heartbeat hammering in his ears, but the beam only illuminated empty, untouched snow. Then he heard it again, this time closer. "Riley." It was coming from deeper within the woods, a faint, echoing call that drifted through the trees like a beckoning invitation. His own voice taunted him, filled with a cold, hollow emptiness that chilled him to the bone. Gripping his rifle tightly, Riley took a hesitant step forward. He knew this was a trap, another tactic to lure him closer, to break him down. But something deeper, something beyond logic, pulled him toward the sound, as if the Wendigo had reached into his mind and twisted his thoughts, manipulating his fear and curiosity. As he walked, the forest seemed to shift and close in around him. Shadows darted at the edge of his vision, flickering like wisps of smoke that vanished as soon as he turned to look. The ground beneath his feet grew softer, and he realized he was following a narrow path that sloped down into a ravine. The snow thinned, replaced by patches of bare earth and frost-covered roots that clawed up from the ground like skeletal fingers. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with other voices now, familiar voices. He heard his father, his mother, his friends, all of them calling out to him in distorted, hollow tones, their words blending together in a maddening cacophony. "Come closer, Riley. Help us." We're waiting for you." He stumbled, gripping the side of a tree to steady himself, his mind spinning. It was too much, the voices, the darkness, the cold seeping into his bones. It felt as if the Wendigo was peeling away his sanity, piece by piece, luring him down into a pit of despair. His every memory, every thought, felt muddled, tainted by the creature's influence. But as he reached the bottom of the ravine, something cut through the fog of fear, a realization, sharp and painful. The journal's last words came back to him, clear as day. It uses them. It becomes them. The Wendigo wasn't just mimicking his voice. It was taking pieces of his mind, twisting his memories, feeding off his fear to make itself stronger. He wasn't just prey. He was becoming a part of it, piece by piece. And that's when he saw it. In the darkness of the ravine, standing perfectly still, the Wendigo waited, its hollow eyes fixed on him, filled with a sick, twisted hunger. It held out one skeletal hand, and in it dangled something familiar, his own flashlight, held like a beacon, casting a ghostly glow across the creature's face. With a shudder, Riley realized he had been holding nothing at all. Riley's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the Wendigo, his own flashlight dangling from its skeletal fingers like a cruel taunt. The reality of his situation crashed down on him. He hadn't even realized his hand was empty. The creature was toying with him, twisting his senses, unraveling his mind. The Wendigo tilted its head, its eyes glinting with a sinister intelligence. It stepped closer, its skeletal frame stretching and contorting with each movement. Riley took a shaky step back, feeling his feet sink into the cold, damp earth of the ravine. He could barely think, his mind clouded with confusion and dread. This wasn't just a physical chase, it was psychological, a game designed to break him down. The creature had learned his thoughts, his memories, his fears, and was using them to strip away every layer of his sanity. "Stay back!" he shouted, though his voice cracked, sounding feeble against the silence of the forest. He lifted his rifle, aiming it at the creature. But deep down, he knew it was futile. The Wendigo was beyond physical harm, a being woven from shadows and starvation, fed by the fears of those it hunted. The creature's mouth stretched into a wide, ghastly grin, exposing rows of jagged teeth. It didn't speak, but Riley felt a presence within his mind, a voice, cold and inescapable, whispering inside his own thoughts. "You cannot run from hunger, Riley." He staggered back, clutching his head, trying to block out the voice that seemed to echo from within. Images flashed in his mind, memories not his own, dark ancient landscapes, bitter winters, and people lost to madness and starvation. He saw visions of endless forests, of twisted souls wandering aimlessly, consumed by hunger and transformed by despair. Suddenly, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, his body growing heavy, as though every ounce of his energy were being drained. He dropped to his knees, his rifle slipping from his hands and sinking into the snow. The Wendigo loomed over him, its hollow eyes flickering with a twisted satisfaction. He could feel its hunger, its need to consume, a darkness that seemed boundless. But somewhere within him, a spark of defiance remained. Riley forced himself to look up, meeting the creature's empty gaze. He wouldn't let it win. He wouldn't let himself be consumed by this ancient evil. In a last act of desperation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal head found at the campsite. He clutched it tightly, the brittle pages crinkling in his grip. The Wendigo paused, tilting its head as if intrigued. Riley flipped to the final page, scanning the smeared, frantic handwriting. The last line caught his eye, a phrase that seemed to pulse with an eerie power. To defeat the hunger, become hollow. He didn't fully understand the meaning, but he clung to it, feeling a strange resolve build within him. Hollow. Was that the answer? He closed his eyes, pushing away the fear, the memories, even the sounds of the forest around him, until he felt a strange emptiness wash over him. He envisioned himself letting go of every thought, every fear, every hope, becoming a void, an empty shell with nothing for the creature to latch onto. He pictured himself as hollow as the creature, empty of fear, empty of anything to devour. The Wendigo let out a guttural, frustrated screech. Riley opened his eyes to see the creature pulling back, its form flickering as though it were losing shape, losing power. He realized then, without fear, without his mind feeding its endless hunger, the Wendigo was weakening. With the last of his strength, Riley rose to his feet, holding the journal in front of him like a shield. The creature hissed, its skeletal form flickering in and out, its hunger met with only emptiness. He took a step forward, and the Wendigo shrank back, retreating into the shadows as if repelled by his newfound resilience. Then, in one final, desperate wail, the Wendigo faded, dissolving into the dark, the forest swallowing it whole. The silence returned, heavier than before, but free of the creature's terrible presence. Riley fell to his knees, breathing heavily, his mind numb. He had survived, but the horror lingered, leaving him hollow, exactly as the journal had warned. Riley sat in the ravine for what felt like hours, staring blankly into the darkness where the Wendigo had vanished. The forest was silent, still heavy with a strange, oppressive calm, as though the creature's absence left a void that even the trees felt. He was alive, but he didn't feel it. He felt hollow, stripped of everything he once knew about himself, his mind frayed and worn. Slowly, he stood, feeling the numbness settle deep into his bones. The journal was still clutched tightly in his hand, its pages smeared and wrinkled. Its final words had saved him, but the price lingered, a cold, yawning emptiness within him that he couldn't shake. He began to climb out of the ravine, his legs heavy, each step feeling like it was dragging him deeper into the snow. The forest seemed larger, stretching endlessly in every direction, and he struggled to remember the path back to his cabin. The memories felt distant now, as though they belonged to someone else. At last, after what felt like an eternity, he saw the faint outline of his cabin through the trees. It looked weathered and small, a fragile shelter in the vast, unyielding wilderness. He pushed open the door and stepped inside, feeling the warmth on his skin but not within. Riley collapsed onto the floor, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion and terror had been holding back. The silence of the cabin was suffocating, filling the space left by the Wendigo with an unshakable dread. Every shadow, every creak, felt like a reminder that he had seen something that wasn't meant for human eyes. He couldn't tell if the creature was truly gone, or if it was lingering somewhere, waiting for him to slip, to weaken. But it was more than that. He could feel a faint, lingering connection, as if a part of the Wendigo was still inside him, etched into his mind. He clutched the journal to his chest, the words echoing in his head, to defeat the hunger, become hollow. He had survived, but he was no longer whole. He could still feel the Wendigo's hunger, like an insatiable whisper that crept into his thoughts when he closed his eyes. As the days passed, Riley became more withdrawn, hardly sleeping, always listening for the faintest sound outside his cabin. He tried to keep himself busy, to forget what he had seen, but the emptiness inside him only grew. He realized the Wendigo's curse was not so easily escaped. He had survived. But in doing so, he had absorbed some part of its darkness, its hunger. On the third night, he awoke to a familiar sound, a whisper, drifting from the edge of the forest, calling his name. Riley. His heart raced, dread flooding back as he sat up, staring out the cabin window. There was nothing there, only the stillness of the trees, but the whisper echoed in his mind, taunting him, luring him back. And then he understood. The Wendigo was gone, but it had left its mark. The hunger was inside him now, a hollow gnawing that would never be filled. The journal's words hadn't been a warning, they had been a transformation. He was the hollow one now. The whisper came again, and Riley, feeling its pull, stepped outside, his feet crunching in the snow as he moved toward the darkness. The hunt was just beginning. Riley moved through the forest, his steps slow and mechanical, as though some invisible force guided him deeper into the woods. The cold seemed sharper, cutting through his clothes, but he barely noticed. His mind was clouded, his thoughts numb. All he could hear was the faint, persistent whisper calling him forward, a voice that was both his and not his, something he couldn't silence. The deeper he went, the more familiar the path felt, though he had no memory of it. Trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches twisting into skeletal shapes against the night sky, watching him as he passed. The forest itself seemed alive, sensing what he was becoming, sensing the change that had taken hold of him. As he moved through the thick snow, flashes of memories surfaced, terrified faces, whispers from lost souls, all consumed by the Wendigo's insatiable hunger. These visions didn't belong to him. They were remnants of those who had fallen to the Wendigo, fragments of lives stolen by the curse. He tried to block them out, but they pulsed through his mind, blurring the line between himself and the creature. He reached the ravine once more, the same place where he had confronted the Wendigo. The memory of that night flickered in his mind, but it was distant, like a story Head once heard rather than something Head lived. He felt the hunger inside him growing, filling the emptiness with a cold, gnawing need. Then, in the silence, he heard a distant crunch of footsteps, a faint, cautious sound cutting through the stillness of the forest. He turned, his senses sharpening, his body tensing in response. He realized with a detached clarity that he wasn't afraid, he was waiting. Through the trees he saw them, a group of hikers moving carefully, bundled up against the cold. They looked out of place, vulnerable in the vastness of the forest, their faces weary as they pushed through the snow, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their sight. As he watched them, a chill spread through his body, and he felt his heart slow, his mind sharpening with a single, primal focus. The hunger pulsed within him, growing louder, filling him with a craving he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a need for food, it was a need to consume, to fill the endless void within. One of the hikers, a young man with a bright red jacket, paused, glancing around nervously. He looked straight in Riley's direction, his eyes scanning the darkness, as if he could sense the presence watching him. Riley remained still, hidden by the shadows, his breathing slow and quiet. He knew what the Wendigo had felt, that sense of power, of domination over the helpless. And he knew he had a choice, the faintest sliver of control left within him. A shred of his humanity that hadn't yet succumbed to the darkness. If he turned away now, he could flee, escape the forest, abandon the pull of the hunger that had taken root inside him. But the hunger was overwhelming, a relentless force that whispered promises of satisfaction, of power, of filling the emptiness he had carried since that night. Riley took a step forward. The hiker froze, his gaze snapping to where Riley stood, his eyes widening in fear as he caught sight of the shadow moving toward him. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" Riley said nothing. His heart was gone, replaced by an icy hollowness that consumed his every thought, his every desire. As he advanced, the forest seemed to close in, embracing him as he let go of the last fragments of himself, the last remnants of the person he had once been. He could see the fear in the hiker's eyes, a reflection of his own terror from that night, but it meant nothing to him now. All that mattered was the hunger, the insatiable need that pulsed within him, consuming him piece by piece. And as the moon hung high above, casting its pale light over the forest, Riley understood fully. He was the Wendigo now, bound to the endless, ravenous darkness of the woods, doomed to haunt the shadows and feast on fear. Forever. The forest would remember his name, but Riley was gone. Only the hollow hunger remained.